March 17th, 1945. Dawn broke over the Wisconsin plains with a pale, almost metallic light, the kind that made the frost sparkle on the barbed wire like thin silver threads. Beyond the guard towers, rows of low wooden barracks sat quiet, the smoke of breakfast fires curling upward in slow, ghostly ribbons. It was the kind of morning that belonged to peace, except that here, on the other side of the fence, peace wore an odd disguise. Uniforms marked POW and boots scuffed from a journey across an ocean at war. Liesl Schaefer stood among a small knot of women, her hands shoved into the coarse wool pockets of a coat that had once been Luftwaffe blue but now hung loose and faded. 22 years old, pale-haired and sharp-eyed, she was still learning what it meant to have lost everything she had believed about the world. Only 6 months earlier she had been a signals assistant in an air base near Bremen, tapping out coded weather reports while Allied bombers thundered overhead. Captured as the Reich crumbled, she had been marched onto a ship with hundreds of other auxiliaries, all of them too stunned to weep, and carried to a country she knew only from propaganda posters that showed skyscrapers and jazz musicians with devilish grins. What struck her first, stepping onto American soil, was not fear but strangeness. The fields unscarred by craters, the towns whole and humming with quiet prosperity. Even the train that brought them north felt surreal. Clean, heated, its windows unbroken. She had imagined cages and starvation. Instead, there were blankets and orderly bunks, and guards who looked more bored than cruel. Still, the barbed wire was real enough. The war had not ended for her, it had only changed its geography. That morning, a rumor had swept through the women's compound. Something was being built beyond the laundry hut. Some said another storeroom. Some whispered about a new punishment block. No one knew what to believe. Since arriving, the women had learned to mistrust any comfort. It felt like bait in a trap. Liesl listened but said little, scanning the horizon for signs. The first surprise was the sound, hammering and the shrill whine of a saw. Then, as the sun climbed, a gate creaked open and an American sergeant stepped through with a clipboard. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, his voice brisk but not unkind. "All right, ladies," he said, gesturing for them to follow. "Come take a look." They hesitated. Orders from Americans always carried a strange double edge, relief that they were still alive to obey, fear that this might be the moment everything turned harsh. A few nurses exchanged wary glances. But curiosity tugged harder than dread. One by one, boots crunching over the frost, they followed the sergeant toward the new structure. It stood apart from the barracks, larger than a storeroom but smaller than the dining hall, its planks raw and pale against the winter fields. 2 soldiers swung open a wide door. Inside, light spilled across a polished wooden floor, new wood, honeygold and smooth as butter. The air smelled faintly of varnish. Liesl stepped in and stopped short. She did not have a word for what she saw, because she had never seen anything like it. A mirrored wall ran the length of one side, reflecting the stunned faces of her companions. Wooden bars were fixed along the walls like the gymnasiums she had only glimpsed in pre-war magazines. In one corner sat a rack of simple free weights, their iron dull but solid. In another, an odd contraption with pedals and a chain, an exercise bicycle, someone whispered. A basketball hoop hung at the far end, its white net crisp and new. The silence broke first with laughter, sharp and nervous. Someone muttered, "Unglaublich," under her breath. A nurse named Greta covered her mouth and stared at her reflection, touching her own cheek as if to confirm she was real. For women who had crossed a continent of rubble and hunger, who had crouched in basements during firebomb raids, the sight was almost insulting in its comfort. Yet there it was, a room built for strength, movement, maybe even joy. Liesl felt a rush of something she couldn't name. Anger? Relief? A kind of vertigo. She thought of her brother Hans, somewhere on the Eastern Front if he was still alive, fighting in mud and snow. She thought of her mother, bartering jewelry for bread back in Bremen. And here she was, an enemy captive, being shown a place to stretch and breathe. It felt like standing on a cliff between two worlds. The sergeant, oblivious to the moral chaos in the room, clapped his hands. "Ladies, this here's your new recreation hall. Command says you need exercise. Keep you healthy, keep you busy." He grinned a little, almost sheepishly. "Suppose the war don't mean you have to sit around getting soft." That earned a ripple of muted chuckles. Even Liesel found herself smiling despite the knot in her stomach. It was so absurd it bordered on comedy. Hitler's so-called elite auxiliaries being encouraged to stay fit under the care of their enemies. Later that morning, after the Americans left, the women drifted through the room in small, uncertain groups. One tested the pedals of the bicycle, another ran a hand along the smooth wooden bar. Someone tossed a ball at the hoop and missed badly. The laughter that followed was strange and warm, like a sound from before the war. For a brief moment, they were not prisoners or enemies, just young women discovering muscles they hadn't thought about since school. Yet beneath the laughter lay unease. Was this kindness or humiliation? Were they being fattened for some propaganda purpose? A nurse named Marta whispered that the Americans must be mocking them, feeding them, pampering them, while Germany bled. Liesel wasn't sure. The guards hadn't mocked. They had seemed almost indifferent, as if this was simply policy. But that was its own kind of shock. The idea that their captors might be following rules rather than vengeance. That night in the barracks, the women talked in low voices long after lights out. Greta confessed she hadn't exercised since before the war and was oddly excited to move again. Marta scoffed but admitted the idea of music and movement sounded like home. Liesel lay awake, staring at the rafters, trying to fit this new reality into the hard shapes of what she had been taught, that Americans were brutal, greedy, eager to crush Germany. Yet today, an American had handed her a chance to feel human again. Sleep came late and uneasy. In dreams she saw her city burning, but also the gleam of polished floors, the mirrored wall catching her reflection, thin, pale, but alive. The next morning, the gym hummed with cautious energy. The women stretched awkwardly, some laughing at their own stiffness. A guard stood by the door, arms folded, clearly uninterested in anything but keeping order. Someone hummed a tune, an old pre-war waltz, and for a heartbeat the air felt light. But beneath the surface, questions simmered. Why had the Americans built this for them when so many at home starved? What game was being played here? And if the enemy could show such unexpected decency, what did that say about everything they had believed, everything they had fought to defend? Liesel caught her reflection again that day, eyes bright with something she couldn't yet name. Not gratitude, not exactly. Perhaps a crack in the certainty that had carried her through war and loss. She touched the mirror, palm against cold glass, and thought of her mother's last letter. Stay strong. Stay German. But here, behind American fences, the meaning of strength was already changing. Outside, the guard shifted his weight, glancing in with mild curiosity. In Washington, officers were debating the cost and purpose of such morale projects for enemy women. And somewhere across the ocean, cities still smoldered. None of the women knew it yet, but this small, improbable room, with its bars and mirrors and quiet defiance of hatred, would be the first crack in a wall of propaganda. It would haunt them when they returned to a broken homeland. It would challenge them to reconcile kindness from the enemy with the world they had been taught to fear. And as the ball bounced once against the polished floor, echoing like a heartbeat in the cold morning air, Liesel felt something shift inside her, a tiny, disorienting step away from the world she had known. The war was still raging, but here, in this strange and spotless gym, an unexpected question had been born, one that would not be easy to silence. The Atlantic crossing had been a gray blur of sea and steel, a voyage without map or meaning for the women packed below deck. Liesel Schaefer remembered the damp salt smell, the endless throb of the engines, and the way silence would spread through the hold when someone dared to whisper about U-boats. They were supposed to be the daughters of a mighty Reich, and yet here they were, unarmed, exhausted, carrying only a few papers and a single change of clothes. By the time the ship docked in New York, the war that had promised glory felt like an old lie unraveling in real time. The first train they boarded into the American heartland was bright and astonishingly clean. Stations rolled by intact, no rubble, no burned-out shells, just red brick depots and waiting families with baskets of food. The women kept their faces blank, but their eyes flicked everywhere, drinking in the proof that the enemy homeland was untouched by the ruin consuming Europe. Some had been told America was chaos and crime. Instead, there were orderly fields, telephone wires strung like silver lines across endless plains, and small towns where children waved at the passing train. When the guards finally told them their destination, a camp in Wisconsin, it sounded like a foreign planet. They were not alone. By 1945, the United States held more than 425,000 Axis prisoners, most of them men, and scattered them across quiet rural bases. But this group was different. They were women, Luftwaffe communication auxiliaries, Kriegsmarine clerks, Red Cross nurses, and a handful of clerical staff swept up when German positions collapsed. Some were barely out of school. Others, like Marta Vogel, had left children behind in bomb-ravaged Hamburg. They were not soldiers, yet they had worn uniforms, saluted superiors, believed they were serving their country. Life inside the camp was strange from the first hour. The gate clanged shut with a finality that tightened every throat, but beyond it the barracks were tidy and heated. Each bunk had a mattress and a thin but clean blanket. Meals arrived on a schedule: bread, potatoes, stew, simple but astonishing after months of ration cards and hunger. A doctor inspected them and treated coughs without a word of malice. Even the guards, young Americans with Midwestern accents, seemed more curious than cruel. "Don't expect sympathy," Marta muttered that first night, but her own voice wavered with confusion. Liesel learned quickly that the camp was a world built by rules rather than rage. The Geneva Convention of 1929 hovered invisibly over everything: rations comparable to American soldiers, medical care, protection from harassment. The women whispered about it at night, incredulous that the enemy obeyed such laws while their own cities burned under Allied bombs. In Germany, propaganda had painted Americans as decadent and savage. Yet here the guards offered cigarettes, allowed letters home, and looked away when someone cried. Still, captivity cut deep. There was no work of substance for them. Unlike male POWs sent to harvest crops or chop lumber, the women remained mostly idle, confined to a fenced compound separated from the men's section. Days stretched long and airless. Some mended clothes or braided each other's hair. Others read the handful of books provided or wrote letters they weren't sure would survive censorship. The quiet could feel heavier than punishment. The letters that did pass through told of devastation. Marta received word that her apartment block in Hamburg was gone, her son evacuated but hungry. Greta learned her fiancé had died on the Western Front. Liesel's mother wrote from Bremen about trading silver spoons for flour. Each new letter was a knife twisting in the stillness of the camp. They were fed and sheltered, but each meal swallowed with guilt, each safe night haunted by the thunder of raids they could not hear. What stunned them most was the contrast. They had stepped out of a collapsing world where every block bore bomb scars and every journey carried danger, and into a country where milk was delivered fresh and music floated from radios at dusk. Sometimes, during roll call, the wind would carry the smell of baking bread from a nearby town, and Liesel would feel dizzy with longing and shame. How could the enemy's land feel so whole while theirs was turned to ash? Amid that uneasy safety, cracks began to form in their certainty. They had been raised on speeches that promised German greatness and told of American decadence, but the reality before them was orderly and humane. Marta, fiercely loyal to her homeland, raged against the kindness, calling it manipulation. Greta, shy and thoughtful, whispered one night that perhaps they had been lied to all along. Liesel said nothing. She felt herself floating between worlds, unable to cling to the slogans of her youth yet unwilling to betray them outright. The guards noticed the quiet boredom and tried to break it with small gestures. A YMCA shipment brought sewing kits, playing cards, and German-language books. The Red Cross delivered care packages. An army memo, read aloud by a sergeant with poor German, explained that prisoners should have recreation to keep them disciplined and sane. It sounded clinical, but it worked. The women began to stir. They organized small singing circles, a few even daring to dance to scratchy records on the rare nights music was allowed. Humor crept in around the edges. Some Americans joked that Hitler's girls are eating better than our GIs. A guard once tried to pronounce a German lullaby and failed so badly that even Marta laughed until she cried. These were tiny moments, but they loosened something inside the fences. The women were enemies, but they were also young and human, and that truth leaked through despite the war. Yet suspicion lingered. Each kindness carried the weight of the war still raging overseas. They wondered if this decency would vanish the moment news came of a German victory or atrocity. They worried about retaliation when they returned home, feared being labeled collaborators for surviving too comfortably. And beneath all of it was the haunting knowledge that their families were suffering while they were spared. Liesel found herself studying the faces of the American soldiers, trying to decipher motive. Did they pity her? Hate her? Simply follow orders? One guard, a boy named Frank with freckles and a farmer's drawl, once handed her a book of poems and shrugged when she tried to thank him. Rules, he said, as if kindness were just another regulation. That shook her more than cruelty might have. Cruelty would have fit the story she'd been told. The longer they stayed, the more the camp seemed to live in a strange gray zone. Not home, not freedom, not hell. It was a waiting room between two collapsing worlds, the Reich dying behind them and some unknown future ahead. Each day they wondered how long it would last, and what price would come when it ended. Then, one chilly morning, the waiting broke in an unexpected way. Word spread that the Americans were building something new beyond the laundry hut. No one could guess its purpose. Another barracks? A punishment hall? Supplies were hauled in secret. Hammers rang through the cold air. Even the guards grew tight-lipped. Liesel watched the construction from the edge of the yard, unease pooling in her stomach. She had come to expect rations and shelter, but not surprises. In a war built on propaganda and betrayal, unexpected gifts were dangerous. Yet the shape rising in the distance didn't look like a cell block. It looked inviting. Whispers spread like sparks. Perhaps a recreation hall, perhaps something stranger. Some women scoffed, others dared to hope. Greta clutched her scarf and said softly, almost guiltily, that she missed movement, music, the feeling of life before the war. Marta rolled her eyes but didn't disagree. No one could have predicted what stood behind those unfinished walls. And when the doors finally opened, the world the women thought they understood, the world divided neatly into friend and foe, savior and monster, would tilt in a way that none of them were prepared for. The day the gym opened, the women entered like explorers stepping onto foreign ground. Sunlight poured through high windows, catching dust motes in golden suspension, and the polished floor shone as if it had been waiting decades for footsteps. A few dared tentative stretches along the mirrored wall, others ran fingers across the wooden bars, still smooth with fresh varnish. Liesel lingered near the doorway, uneasy yet drawn forward. She had lived months now in the slow pulse of captivity, surviving on letters, memories, and guilt. This space felt alive, disruptive, a promise of movement when life had been reduced to stillness. At first the Americans supervised with military briskness. A sergeant demonstrated the exercise bicycle, his boots squeaking against the immaculate boards, then stepped aside with an almost embarrassed shrug. "Your turn," he said. Greta climbed on, pedaled twice, and laughed in shock at the chain's soft clatter. Others followed, hesitating, then giggling like schoolgirls rediscovering their bodies. The sound startled even them. War had long silenced such carefree laughter. Soon the room filled with unfamiliar rhythms, the slap of a basketball, the hollow echo of shoes turning for a dance step, the clink of light dumbbells. Music seeped in too, scratchy swing records borrowed from the guards. Liesel watched Marta, usually so guarded, sway slightly to the beat before catching herself and blushing. The irony hung thick, daughters of the Reich moving to the same music the Nazi radio had condemned as degenerate. The Americans had their reasons, though none of them felt personal. An officer explained through an interpreter that keeping prisoners healthy and occupied reduced trouble. Idle minds rebelled, active ones stayed docile. Article 17 of the Geneva Convention encouraged physical exercise, he said, as if quoting scripture. The explanation sounded coldly practical, yet the effect was anything but. The gym became a refuge, a place where the women could breathe, sweat, and for an hour forget the collapsing Reich. Letters home revealed their astonishment. Sensors intercepted messages describing a hall with mirrors and music, and bicycles to ride though we are prisoners. Some prisoners dared to sketch the room in pencil, sending home visions their families would scarcely believe. Marta wrote bitterly that she could not explain why her captors gave her bread and space to dance while her son queued for soup in ruins. Greta's letters brimmed with conflicted gratitude. They treat us, not like enemies but like people. American newspapers occasionally caught wind of these amenities and bristled. Headlines accused the army of coddling Nazis while U.S. boys bled abroad. "Prisoners have gyms while our troops fight without comfort," one Wisconsin editorial raged. Yet the War Department held its ground. Humane treatment, they argued, encouraged enemy surrender and protected American POWs held overseas. It was strategy wrapped in decency. Inside the wire, though, the women experienced something stranger than policy. The gym became a mirror, not just of their faces but of the collapse of everything they'd been taught. The Nazi ideal of the strong, obedient German woman had told them to serve, endure, and hate. Here, their enemy handed them a ball and said, simply, play. The contrast was almost unbearable. Liesel felt it most acutely when she discovered she loved the feel of movement again. At first she stayed near the wall, arms folded, watching others test the strange American game of basketball. But one afternoon Greta coaxed her into joining. The ball was warm from many hands. Its leather felt alive. When she managed an awkward throw that sailed through the hoop, the other women cheered, and something inside her cracked, a small, bright fracture in the heaviness she carried. For the first time in months she forgot the war long enough to feel young. Yet joy was never simple. Each time they laughed, guilt surged like a tide. Marta often muttered that they were being softened, lulled into shame while Germany fought on. "They want us tame," she said one night, pacing the barracks. But even she could not resist the pull of the gym. Liesel once found her alone there, trying a cautious dance step to a tune barely audible from a distant radio. When their eyes met, Marta's defiance faltered. "Just for a minute," she whispered. The guards, too, seemed altered by the space. Some grew less stiff, nodding hello, occasionally explaining a rule of basketball or demonstrating a stretch. Frank, the freckled soldier who had once given Liesel a poetry book, showed her how to grip the ball. "Keep your elbow in," he said, grinning shyly when she managed a better shot. It was not friendship, but it was a thaw, a recognition of shared youth across enemy lines. Beyond this small compound, similar scenes unfolded in other camps. Reports from Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia described women organizing calisthenics and gymnastics under American supervision. In Indiana, a recreation hall echoed with music lessons and dance. By late 1945, more than 100 camps offered some form of indoor exercise for female POWs. Army memos noted improved morale and fewer discipline problems where women could move, create, and sweat. What began as bureaucratic strategy became, in practice, a quiet cultural collision. The women's shifting hearts were harder to measure, but just as real. For Greta, the gym was a reminder that not all strength belonged to uniforms or propaganda posters. It could live in laughter and resilience. Marta wrestled with anger but could not deny the decency she witnessed, however unwanted. Liesel moved like someone learning a new language, halting, unsure, yet pulled forward by curiosity. The war had taken her brother, her city, her certainty. Here, behind barbed wire, she found the first seed of another kind of strength, one not given by the Reich but discovered in herself. Still, danger lurked in hope. Rumors spread that returning home after such treatment could be perilous. Some feared Soviet interrogators would brand them collaborators. Others dreaded the cold welcome of families who had suffered while they were fed and sheltered. Every kindness from the Americans risked becoming a source of suspicion later. The gym, for all its warmth, might mark them as tainted. One evening, after a long day of play and practice, the women lingered in the silent hall. Sunset painted the mirrors orange and gold. Greta sat hugging her knees, tears sliding silently down her face. "My fiancé died for lies," she said softly, to no one in particular. Marta reached over and touched her shoulder, hesitant but real. Liesel watched and felt the weight of two worlds pressing, the dead one she had left and the fragile new one whispering that enemies could be human. Outside, spring was coming. The guards talked of Germany collapsing, of surrender not far off. Every day brought new rumors, Hitler retreating, cities falling. The gym filled with restless energy, the women aware that their strange sanctuary might soon vanish. But it had already done something irreversible. It had shown them a world beyond the narrow rage they were taught. It had given them an image of America that could not be undone by propaganda or fear. On the last day of March, an officer entered the hall with fresh orders. Repatriation was coming. The war's end was near, and soon ships would carry them back across the Atlantic. The announcement dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples of dread and relief. Home meant freedom but also hunger, ruin, and suspicion. Here they had been prisoners. There they would be strangers. As the officer left, silence stretched across the polished floor. Liesel looked into the mirror one last time, seeing not the obedient girl who had served the Reich, but someone altered by small, defiant acts of humanity. Around her, women shifted uneasily, sensing the same change but unsure if it would save them or condemn them. And somewhere deep within, beyond the fences and watchtowers, the larger world was still tearing itself apart. Yet here, in this improbable gym built by enemies, a quiet revolution had begun, one that might outlive the war itself. The first ship that would carry them home appeared on a cool April morning, its gray hull cutting across the harbor like an omen. The women stood on the dock in borrowed coats, each clutching a small bundle of possessions. Months of captivity had left them healthier than they had arrived, faces filled out by steady meals, skin no longer hollow with hunger, but their eyes betrayed unease. Home was no longer the home they had left. Germany was a rumor of rubble and suspicion, and the Atlantic stretched between them and the strange safety they were about to abandon. Liesl Schaefer felt the weight of that distance in her chest. The gym's polished floor, the smell of varnish and sweat, the music they dared to dance to, it all felt fragile now, like a dream that could dissolve the moment the ship turned east. She had entered the camp believing the world was simple. Enemies and allies, loyalty and betrayal. Now nothing fit so neatly. She had laughed with women she barely knew, learned to play basketball under the eyes of men she had been told were monsters, and received letters that told of starvation at home while she lived in warmth. The contradictions left her dizzy. Marta Vogel stood nearby, stoic but pale. She had once railed against every kindness, warning the others that the Americans' comfort was a trap. Yet even she seemed unsteady as the ship loomed. Her son awaited her somewhere in Hamburg. She clung to that hope. But she feared the questions she might face, why she had lived in safety, why she had returned whole. She feared, too, the possibility that the world she fought for had died while she was kept alive by those she hated. Greta hugged her coat tighter against the cold, the corners of her mouth trembling. She had found an unlikely resilience in captivity, discovering strength in movement, in the simple joy of learning a new game, in the dignity of being treated as human despite everything. But she knew that dignity might evaporate once she stepped onto German soil. The stories of Soviet interrogations had spread through the camp like smoke, prisoners accused of treachery simply for surviving too well. Even among their own, suspicion was as sharp as hunger. The Americans who guarded them showed no gloating triumph as they prepared the women to leave. Frank, the freckled soldier who had once taught Liesl to shoot a basketball, nodded at her as she boarded the ship. There was no warmth in his farewell, but no hatred either, just a quiet, almost respectful acknowledgement. Liesl wanted to say something but couldn't find words that fit the strangeness between them. The crossing back was calmer than their first voyage, but silence hung heavy. The women kept mostly to themselves, staring at the gray sea and thinking of cities turned to ash. Some played cards or sang softly at night, but the songs lacked the force they once held. Each woman seemed to live in her own uneasy future. Greta wrote in her notebook by dim light, her pen scratching against paper as if trying to anchor something before it vanished. Marta polished the small silver locket that held a photo of her son. Liesl walked the deck alone, breathing salt air and watching gulls follow in the ship's wake, wondering if she had the courage to live with the truths she now carried. When they reached Bremen, the ruins swallowed them whole. Smoke still clung to the city like an old coat. Streets were choked with bricks and splintered beams. Families wandered with carts piled high with scraps of furniture. Children scavenged coal from rubble heaps. It was worse than Liesl had imagined. The house where she had grown up was gone, replaced by a skeletal wall and the smell of damp ash. She found her mother in a cramped cellar room, older by decades, eyes hollow but alive. They embraced with desperate relief, but joy soon tangled with questions. How had she survived? Where had she been kept? Was it true, as neighbors whispered, that the Americans fed their prisoners well? Liesl could not lie, but the truth sounded treacherous even as she spoke it. Marta faced harsher suspicion. Returning to Hamburg, she found neighbors bitter and hollow-eyed. They eyed her intact body and warm coat with thinly veiled anger. "Must have been nice," one woman muttered as Marta passed. Her son clung to her legs, frightened but alive, yet even his embrace could not shield her from the resentment of those who had starved. She learned to speak little of the camp, never of the gym, for fear of being marked as one who had lived too well. Greta married a year later, but she carried the camp within her like a secret chamber. She told her husband only the barest details, that she had been taken prisoner, that she had survived. The rest, music, movement, the impossible kindness of a basketball hoop built by enemies, she shared only decades later, when her grandchildren asked about the war. By then the shock had softened into wonder, but it still felt dangerous, like stepping onto forbidden ground. For Liesel, the experience became a quiet compass. The Reich had crumbled. Her brother Hans never returned from the East. The world demanded rebuilding, not blind obedience. She trained as a teacher, determined to show her students something she had learned behind wire, that strength was not cruelty, and that enemies could choose humanity. Yet she spoke cautiously, aware how fragile such lessons were in a land rebuilding its pride. Only in old age, long after Germany had changed, did she tell her full story, of mirrors and music behind barbed wire, of how it shattered the lies she had grown up with. The gym itself faded into memory, a small footnote in American reports about morale. But to the women who had lived it, it became a symbol of contradictions they could never fully resolve, of decency found where they expected hatred, of the strange mercy that complicated their understanding of war. It was proof that even amid global violence, someone had decided to give their captives room to move and breathe. Years later, historians would pore over army records and find dry notes. Recreation facilities provided to female internees improved discipline and health. Numbers of prisoners, shipping logs, expense tallies. But the official documents could not capture the jolt in a young woman's chest when she first saw her reflection in an enemy's mirror, or the tremor of joy when a basketball dropped clean through a net while her homeland burned. Those moments were not policy. They were something wilder and more human. By the time Liesel was an old woman, she had outlived most of the war's noise. She sat once in a quiet kitchen, telling a curious journalist about that day in Wisconsin when the doors swung open. Her hands trembled slightly on the teacup. "It was so small," she said. "Just a room to move in. But it broke something in me. Or maybe it fixed something." She paused, then smiled faintly. "I had been taught to hate. But hate couldn't survive that floor." The story she told was not of surrender but of awakening. It was not the tale of a nation's defeat but of a young woman realizing that enemies could choose to be more than enemies. That revelation did not erase the suffering or the guilt of survival. It simply lived alongside them, persistent and inconvenient. It was a truth that refused to be bombed away. As she finished speaking, the journalist asked if she thought the Americans had known what they were doing. Liesel shook her head slowly. "I think they were just following rules," she said. "But kindness, even when it's only rules, can still change a life." Outside her window, decades after the war, children played basketball on a cracked pavement court. Their laughter floated in, high and bright, echoing faintly of another place, another time. Liesel listened, and for a moment she was back in that improbable gym behind the wire, hearing the first clean bounce of a ball on polished wood, feeling her world tilt toward something she could not yet name. It had begun as a strategy, a bureaucratic effort to keep prisoners calm. It ended as a seed planted deep in the hearts of those who were supposed to hate forever. And though the war itself ended in smoke and rubble, that quiet act of unexpected decency endured, proof that even amid the darkest human conflict, someone can build a space for grace.